And welcome, everybody. So again, I'm Chad Lineweaver. I'm the director at the Morristown and Morris Township Library. And tonight we have Tom Silver, who's going to talk about Hokusai in Japan and the floating world. If you have an interest in Japanese prints or even Japanese art, Tom is your guy. So it's worthwhile to touch base with him. Tom lives part-time in Barnstable up in Cape Cod, but also in Morristown. And he's a graduate of Drew. Tom, I think you're actually in Barnstable, though, right now. Is that correct?
I'm in Barnstable right now. That's correct. Coming to you from Cape Cod.
So there we go. But he's a retired banker, a classical guitarist, and a recording artist who developed an interest in Japanese prints and Japanese art when he was searching for an unusual gift for his wife, Helen. And that search sparked this whole love of art that grew to encompass Japanese history and culture and beyond that. And Tom's talks at libraries and other institutions showcase print masterpieces covering the pretty much 350-year history of the Japanese print genre. This is his third talk for us. And without further ado, Tom, I'm going to have you take it right away about Hokusai, and everybody, Tom Silver.
Thank you, Chad. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for being here. I just want to say a couple of things before we get started. First, I want to acknowledge my wife, Helen Foley Silver, who put her artistic talents to work designing the entire presentation we're about to see, the frames and other things you're going to see. And as an artist herself, she contributed a number of ideas which are central to the presentation. So I wanted to say that. And then secondly, as Chad alluded to, we have so much to talk about this evening and so much wonderful art to look at that I hope it's okay if questions can be held to after the presentation, although as Chad says, you can certainly put them into the chat and then we'll address them during the Q&A. All right. On the morning of May 18, 1849, the man who was to become the world's most celebrated Japanese artist in over 1,500 years of Japan's recorded history died in his 90th year in Tokyo, which was then known as Edo. And he had started painting at the age of 6, and it's estimated that over his career, he had produced some 30,000 works of art. Well, today his name is recognized throughout the world, and that fact can be attributed, at least in part, to just a single print he created in 1830, which now adorns countless consumer items, such as tote bags, t-shirts, refrigerator magnets, coffee mugs, and even masks, as I just learned a few minutes ago. And we'll see that print later. It's not this one. Yet he died impoverished and was given a funeral only because friends and pupils chipped in to pay for one. Well, the artist's name was Katsushika Hokusai, the U is silent, although at the time of his death, he had been calling himself Manji, old man mad about painting. And I'd just like to relate a couple of very quick stories to kind of give you a flavor for the man. He was a man of immense imagination and introspection, at least when it came to his own art. He once painted the image of a Buddhist monk on special thick paper measuring 59 feet by 35 feet, had someone attach a beam to the top, and he had it hauled into the air as a publicity stunt. Just take a look at that. This is a recreation of what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, the original was destroyed in World War II. Now, Hokusai had done this kind of thing at least once before, and he used brooms as paintbrushes, and he had vats of ink and vats of water available as well. Now, the second story is that on his deathbed, the story goes that Hokusai lamented that if he only had another 10 years, sometimes the story goes another 5 years, but if he just had a little bit more time, he'd finally get to the bottom of this art thing and find out how to do painting, what painting was really all about. Well, I guess we can all make our own judgments about how successful he had been in life as we go through the presentation. And that story may or may not be apocryphal. I have no way of knowing, but it's a fun story. Now, history describes the period in which Hokusai lived as pre-modern Japan, or sometimes you could say pre-Westernized Japan. And it was a continuation of a centuries-long feudal society, not entirely unlike the feudalism we know in European history. So there was an emperor during Hokusai's lifetime and well before, who was roughly equivalent to the European Pope. There was a shogun, equivalent to a European king or queen. There were daimyo, equivalent to the landholding nobility in Europe. And there were samurai, also known as retainers, who were akin to medieval European knights. Now, within a couple of decades of Hokusai's death in 1849, these three categories disappeared and the emperor became supreme. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail coming up. Now, the title of our presentation, Hokusai in Japan and the Floating World, describes each of those three aspects of our discussion, which, by the way, should run about 75 minutes plus whatever time we need for the Q&A. We are going to spend most of our time on Hokusai and his art, but first, I'd like to take about 20 minutes to talk about the other two elements of our presentation, Japan and the Floating World, to provide a flavor for the period and lay a foundation for understanding what Hokusai's world was like. So with those preliminaries out of the way, let's start with this. Hokusai created his art during the last third of Japan's Edo era, which, as you can see, began in one of these 3 years, depending on which one of these three key events the historian you're reading thinks should launch the period. As we know, historians don't always agree on things like that. And the Edo era is named after the small fishing village of Edo, which later became the capital of the great Tokugawa shogunate, and by the early 17th century, happened to become one of the largest cities in the world. Now, the Tokugawa shogunate ruled Japan until November 1867, when powerful military forces backed by provinces in the west and the south of Japan took over. They basically kicked the shogun out and installed the emperor as ruler of Japan. Now, you may know that Japan still has an emperor to this day. The current emperor's name is Naruhito, although, like England, Japan is a constitutional monarchy. Well, the following year, in 1868, the name Edo changed to the Japanese capital that the world knows today, Tokyo, which literally means Eastern capital in English. So Japan's recorded history may go back some 1,500 years, but the name Tokyo goes back less than 200. In fact, Japan had two capitals during Hokusai's day and prior. Edo, the eastern capital, was the military and governmental capital where the shogun was based, and Kyoto, the western capital, was the spiritual and cultural capital of Japan and home of the emperor, who was a passive figure in this era, unlike the shogun, until he took over in 1868. And in case you're wondering, these two capitals are separated by some 230 miles, which is nothing in today's era of bullet trains, but back in Hokusai's day, that was quite a hike. Now, sometimes the Edo period is more colorfully described as the floating world, or ukiyo in Japanese. And I'm going to use the terms floating world, Edo era, Edo period interchangeably here. The term ukiyo-e, very important term, means pictures of the floating world, or can also mean prints of the floating world. And you'll often see the entire Japanese print genre, the Edo era, referred to by that same term, ukiyo-e, which kind of became a catch-all term for the great body of prints during the Edo era. Now, we're going to see that Hokusai was a very religious, very spiritual person. And so I'm going to talk about Buddhism just for a little bit before we move on. And it's going to be important when we look at a couple of Hokusai's prints, specific prints, later in the presentation. So the term ukiyo originally described the classic Buddhist way of looking at life, where there's a fruitless quest to satisfy our worldly desires. Ultimately, there's sorrow and suffering in life, and life is cyclical, impermanent. A world of life, death, and rebirth, unless you exit that cycle by attaining a state of nirvana. All right. Now, so the Buddhist concept of impermanence of the world, that's really where we get the floating world. An impermanent world is sort of a floating world, and vice versa. Now, in the Edo era, let me just go back to that for a second. In the Edo era, people started using the term ukiyo in a different way. So instead of the Buddhist world of sorrow here, the floating world became a world of pleasure. And essentially the idea was this: if pleasure in this incarnation is fleeting, why not make the most of it while we can? Or as we say, carpe diem, seize the day. So hedonism became the watchword in the Edo era, living for today, living for worldly pleasure for those who could afford it. And in the great economic boom of the Tokugawa shogunate, many, many people could afford it. Well, what explains the switch from sorrow to pleasure? In a word, cash, money. The explosion in wealth that I just mentioned during the Tokugawa period, beginning in the early 17th century and running right through this period. And that was wealth which underwrote much of the art of this period, especially prints. Now, money in this era was spent freely as well as hedonistically on things like kabuki theater, which consisted, believe it or not, of wild and erotic dancing at its inception, before it became a stylized art form, before there were theaters like this one. And also money was spent at pleasure districts like the famous Yoshiwara in Edo, documented in this print. Now, Sarah Thompson, who is a Japanese art curator at the MFA in Boston, the Museum of Fine Arts, tells us that kabuki theater and the Yoshiwara virtually defined the floating world and its art, I might add. Although Hokusai broke away from these two subjects in his art as his career took off early in the 19th century. Now take a look at this. Social status groups, or the social hierarchy in Hokusai's day. Okay. The aristocracy was bifurcated. It consisted of the warrior class headed by the shogun in Edo and the emperor and court nobles at the imperial city of Kyoto. And for them, both these categories, prints replicated in the thousands and pulled from wood blocks, were very much art for the masses. Japanese prints, with very, very few exceptions, reflected the everyday lives of everyday people who were little interest to those at the top. So the Western pejorative term bourgeois suited their view, the aristocrats' view of Japanese prints, very nicely indeed. In fact, artists generally did not have the special status they enjoy in modern times in both Western countries and Japan. They were seen more as artisans than artists. And they were classed alongside people like blacksmiths, roofers, butchers, undertakers, and the like. Well, what kind of prints were especially disdained by those at the top? And this will be important for understanding Hokusai's work when we get to it. Well, the answer is the same prints which dominated the period before Hokusai got going. 17th and 18th century sensationalistic subjects, which focused on popular kabuki actors like the Sharaku in the left panel, and famous courtesans of the Yoshiwara pleasure district we just mentioned, like this very famous Utamaro in the right panel, both in keeping with the pleasure-seeking culture of the floating world. I would just go back to this slide for a moment. Why were those two categories so disdained? Well, if we look at the underclass down here, courtesans and kabuki actors were part of that underclass. So the upper crust here really wanted nothing to do with them. And as a matter of fact, we in the West, if we think of Japanese prints, we probably think first, we think of Japanese art, we probably think first of Japanese prints, but there's a whole lot more to Japanese art than Japanese prints. So these people were interested in those other categories, hanging scrolls, screen paintings, decorated boxes, lacquer work. There's plenty of other Japanese art that they were interested in. Well, from early on, the Tokugawa shogunate was largely about controlling the population at all levels, and in many ways, but I'll just mention two: access to key commodities like silk and rice. So there were policies which limited what ordinary people could wear and eat. And there's actually a term for this, which is known as sumptuary laws, and you see that in European history as well. One of their purposes was to preserve distinction of class or rank. And let's take silk as an example first. So if you were at the top of the social hierarchy, like the samurai here, representing the warrior class, and in this case, played by a kabuki actor, presumably wearing a silk kimono. They usually did. You didn't want well-off merchants who could afford the finest silk clothing to be allowed to buy it and thereby dilute your social status. Now look at rice. Rice farmers were directed to minimize consumption of this valuable crop planted with their own backbreaking labor. So here's a 19th century photograph colored in by hand, which shows what it must have been like to work bent over like that all day long before the advent of modern machinery into Japan. Okay, let's talk about the merchant class briefly in this period, because as I said, it was their growing incomes which provided critical support for the Japanese print trade. And those merchants, to a large extent, mirrored the rise of merchant capitalism in Europe several centuries earlier, the most famous of which were the Medici in Florence. And just to give you some idea of who was included among those merchants in Japan, well, two of the biggest international names in Japanese industry and finance today, Sumitomo and Mitsui, got their start in the 17th century floating world of the Tokugawa shogunate. So here we're looking at the backs of merchant-owned warehouses and shops depicted in this Hokusai print, which we'll see again later and discuss in much more detail when we talk about Hokusai. Well, with the rise of commerce during the Tokugawa shogunate, the Edo period is sometimes referred to as an urban culture or a merchant culture, and this was the milieu in which Hokusai lived and created his art. He was a city boy, although he's known mainly for his art of the country. What did these merchants sell that brought so much profit? Well, for one thing, they brokered rice sales in bulk for shipment around the country. Rice was a cornerstone of Japan's economy in this era. In fact, wealth and taxation were measured not by how much land you had, but by the rice-producing potential of that land. So what else made those merchants so rich? Well, among many other things, they sold fine cabinetry, lacquerware, musical instruments, and swords made from the finest hand-fashioned steel, all supplied to them by the merchant class. Japanese swords are considered the finest in the world. There are actually a few master swordsmiths left in Japan, and their product, of course, is bought by collectors, not by warriors. But it's amazing what they were able to do a millennium ago before anything was known about formal metallurgy. Now, let's say something about early Europeans in Japan, because they were to have a direct impact on Japanese art and much more in Japan. And the first to arrive were Portuguese explorers in the early 1540s. And they were soon followed by Spanish Jesuit missionaries, and then around the turn of the century, from the 16th to the 17th, by the English and the Dutch. Excuse me just for one moment. But the English soon quit Japan for better trading opportunities elsewhere in Asia. And the Spanish and the Portuguese were actually expelled by the shogun because he saw their missionaries as a threat to his authority. One result, as the knowledgeable observers pointed out, is that there were probably more Japanese Christian converts in the 1590s than there were Japanese Christians in the 1950s. But the Dutch, who had warred against Catholic Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries, they were permitted to remain because they were in Japan for business, so they were not seen as a threat to the shogun's authority. And they brought more than just trade. The Dutch also brought art, because they knew they'd be away for a long time and they wanted things which would remind them of home. And of course, we think of the 17th century as the golden age of Dutch painting, the era of Rembrandt, Vermeer, Frans Hals, and many others. So it's likely that at least some of the paintings the Dutch brought to Japan were pretty spectacular, maybe along the lines of this Peter de Hoogh. And I show this as an example of the quality of painting which wealthy Dutch merchants might well have brought to Japan. I have no definitive knowledge that this painting was brought over, but I do believe it's representative of the kinds of some of the paintings that were brought to Japan. Now, this development, the introduction of Western painting into Japan, would prove highly significant for Japanese art, as Western ideas about composition, like linear perspective or shading to create a sense of depth, spread to Japan in this way and influenced some of Hokusai's art as well, as we're going to see. Now, to be fair and to complete the picture, I should add that Japanese prints, among other Japanese art forms, were to have a reciprocal influence on Western art, but that would need to await the later 19th and early 20th centuries. And we'll see examples of that reciprocity, west to east and east to west, as we go through the presentation. So it really did become a cultural two-way street between Japan and the West eventually. Now, the significance of the Dutch in Japan from the 17th all the way into the 19th century goes beyond art. The Dutch brought books and people with direct knowledge of science, such as navigators on board their ships who had to know something about at least certain aspects of science. In fact, the presence of 16th and 17th century Europeans meant that Western knowledge of geography, blue water navigation, medicine, even gunnery became available to Japanese intellectuals and to the shogunate. So there was a lot of the West in Japan during Hokusai's lifetime and even a few centuries before. Well, today Japan has many attributes of Western countries, even though lots of ancient traditions like Japanese gardens, bowing to show respect, removing your shoes upon entering a house, coexist alongside technology, democracy, and baseball. And as we've seen in this introduction, the roots of that Westernization mostly go back to the early floating world of the Edo era. Well, there's so much more that could be said by way of introduction and background, but now it's time to turn to our main subject, Hokusai and the 19th century. Note, by the way, that Hokusai's life spanned most of the latter half of the 18th century and virtually all of the first half of the 19th century. Well, if I had to choose only two characteristics to describe Hokusai as artist, I'd pick love of nature and spirituality. As for love of nature, well, it's important to note that geography and topography have combined to favor Japan from the standpoint of scenery. Many sections of Japanese coastline are striking, and along with lush wooded mountain areas like we see here, which are green from abundant rainfall and snowfall, Japan is a particularly beautiful land. So an appreciation for nature is embedded in the Japanese soul and came naturally to Hokusai and pervades his art. But Hokusai's spirituality is less obvious than his love of nature, and it's impossible to really understand his art without knowing that about him. Like most Japanese, Hokusai was both a Buddhist and a follower of Shinto, which is an ancient Japanese religion encompassing many deities and ancestor worship. So among other things, it includes a belief that elements of nature, such as mountains, oceans, waterfalls, trees, plants, flowers, all those things are imbued with a spiritual or divine essence, and that belief is going to figure into this presentation. Hokusai himself was deeply spiritual, very religious. The very name Hokusai, which he chose for himself, that was not his birth name. He chose it for himself when he was 37 years old. He chose it as his professional name or art name, as it was called back then. And Hokusai literally means North Studio, by which he meant North Star Studio, because the North Star was an important element in the Nichiren Buddhist sect to which he belonged. All right, now let me give you some examples of the range of Hokusai's art before we spend the rest of the evening looking at it, starting with the very next slide. He worked in traditional Japanese prints, to be sure, but he was proudest of his work as a painter. That's mainly how he thought of himself. In fact, it's very likely that the first Hokusai art to find its way to Europe was not prints at all, but a small group of paintings commissioned by the Dutch East India Company in the early 1820s. That said, although paintings and many other art forms flourished in the floating world, it's prints for which the floating world is remembered today. Paintings, for example, were far more expensive and time-consuming to produce on a per-unit basis. Obviously, they're one of a kind. Whereas once a print was created, it could be reproduced in the hundreds or even thousands, sometimes even tens of thousands, at relatively little additional cost. And therefore, prints sold much more cheaply than paintings. And this made them affordable to almost anyone in the floating world. They sold for roughly the cost of a bowl of noodles. And that explains why there's so many Japanese prints in museums and in the hands of collectors today. And speaking of museums, I want to note that the world's first Hokusai exhibition that took place in a museum was not in Japan, but was at the MFA in Boston at the end of the 19th century. Now, but getting back to Hokusai's wide-ranging work, he illustrated books. That was sort of a bread and butter business for him early on. He illustrated poetry on what we can think of as greeting card prints known as surimono, which were usually commissioned by poetry clubs. He produced cutout dioramas and cutout toys, and he produced manga, the forerunner of today's Japanese comics and anime, or animated films. And manga means sketches or whimsical drawings. So in the left-hand panel here are examples of Hokusai's manga, which were instructional sketches he created for his art students and other artists. Turns out that 15 volumes of these sketches were published, and they became a hit in 19th century Europe, which helped to spread Hokusai's fame. The right-hand panel contains modern sketches, which show the influence of Hokusai's manga, although I suppose you have to use your imagination a little bit in that. But we're going to focus on Hokusai's prints because that's how he's known today, and we'll take a brief look later at several other media he worked in. So let's start with Hokusai's Waterfall series, which consists of 8 prints, but we'll have time to look at 2. And let's start with a photograph. This is a picture of the Kurifuri Waterfall, which is about 245 feet high, and it's located about 75 miles north of Tokyo, or Edo back then. And Kurifuri literally means falling mist. So let's see what Hokusai did with this waterfall. And here's that same waterfall transformed by Hokusai's creative mind. One of the things that's so fascinating about this is that there's some real chance Hokusai never even saw this waterfall, because at that time, most people in Japan got around on foot. They couldn't afford to rent or own a horse or hire what was known as a palanquin cart. The concept was sort of like an Uber today, but without an engine. And many of Hokusai's landscape subjects were some distance round trip from his home in Edo. So sometimes he would work from illustrations and travel guidebooks. And yes, there were travel guidebooks in Japan 200 years ago. Or sometimes he'd work entirely from his own imagination. Sometimes he just made it up. And all this was very common for Japanese landscape artists at the time. All right, looking at this print, one of the things that makes Hokusai so admired is the energy and the power he's able to convey and the sense of motion he can bring to his art. We're going to talk a lot about motion later on. You can just feel the awesome power of this waterfall as it cascades down to the stream with surging movement in the stream itself. One writer sees this waterfall as almost alive with its flowing branches of water here, almost as if they're life's blood flowing through arteries. Well, as a follower of Shinto, Hokusai had a special interest in waterfalls because of their use in certain purification rituals. In fact, he used the purifying aspect of water as a continuing theme throughout his art, including ocean waves, rivers, streams, snow, and rain, and we'll see some examples. Well, let's look at our second waterfall, again, starting with a photograph. This is a picture of the Amita Waterfall, about 200 feet high and located en route from Edo to Kyoto. And it was named by a Buddhist monk about 500 years ago who had a vision of the Amita Buddha while that monk was meditating nearby. Follow my cursor, and you notice up here we cannot see the source of the water flowing into the fall. So please keep that in mind. It's going to be important in a minute. All right, let's see what Hokusai did with this one. Now, Amita, again, after whom this waterfall is named, is one of the great Japanese Buddhas of compassion. So according to one Buddhist school of thought, and there are many, even if you led a bad life, upon your death, you could go to the Pure Land, a kind of idealized afterlife located in a Western paradise, just by calling out to Amita on your deathbed, saying something like, save me, Amita, or I take refuge in you, Amita. That would do it. And in case you're wondering why Hokusai would show the source of the waterfall in this big circle here that we couldn't even see in the photograph, well, some people see this circle as Amita's head or his round eye, but there's a much more interesting explanation than that. Let's look at this waterfall again, side by side with the photograph, but this time with a few changes. And I apologize for this levitating cat down here, but there isn't anywhere else to place it in order to make the point I need to make. So if you look at the vegetation growing out of this outcropping of rock here, well, the cat can see it from down here looking up, but this green bird all the way at the top can't see it perched all the way up here. How can it see under a rock below? On the other hand, the cat certainly can't see the water source from its position, but the bird can looking down from its perch. The cat also can't see the top of these pilgrims' heads. These are pilgrims, by the way. They're not just tourists, because remember, we said that waterfalls were important as in purification rituals in Shinto. So they were there for religious reasons. Now, so the cat can't see the top of their head, but the heron can. So what am I getting at? What's this all about? Well, in classical East Asian landscape painting, limiting a landscape to a particular viewer's line of sight in traditional Western linear perspective just was not important. What was important was to represent nature as it exists, which of course is not limited to any one perspective. And also to be able to show different things, different scenes going on, people, animals doing their thing from different vantage points. So mountains in East Asian, classical East Asian art were usually depicted from multiple vantage points in a single painting, something which would become a key attribute of Cubism in the West, as we know, although it was usually a lot more subtle in East Asian painting than what we see here with Hokusai. This is very obvious, hits you between the eyes, and certainly a lot more subtle than Picasso's art, for example. So Hokusai would not have thought twice about including the waterfall source up here, which we can't see standing at the base of the waterfall. Let's say we're standing on the rocks here. There's no way we can see where the water is coming from, but it's coming from somewhere. So why not show the source, whether we can see it or not? Hokusai also would have been unconcerned about this huge outcropping of rock, this ledge, which we know from the photograph isn't even there, but in theory, it could exist.
I'm just watching a Zoom show.
Pardon? Okay.
Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, which in theory could exist in nature, and it was included because it suited Hokusai's artistic and spiritual purposes. Now, the reason I mention all this is because coming up, we're going to see how Hokusai was influenced by Western ideas in art, and how the long arm of Hokusai and his predecessors, in turn, influenced Western art for at least 50 years after Hokusai's death in 1849. But I wanted to show you now that there's no way Hokusai completely abandoned his own Eastern tradition. Now, remember earlier we talked about how kabuki actors and courtesans were the main subjects for Japanese prints before the 19th century, when we looked at this very slide? Well, early in the Edo period, it was difficult to travel from one domain to another. You needed permission. You needed a good reason to travel. The shogun and the shogunate was very suspicious. Well, by the early 19th century, the shogunate's power was on the wane, so travel finally became feasible. So a fashion for touring and sightseeing developed, which would subordinate kabuki and courtesan themes in Japanese prints to landscapes and other subjects. And this rush to tourism was a great business opportunity for print publishers to follow this new fashion and make money publishing landscape prints, especially prints of famous places, which are called in Japanese, meisho-e. Now, it's true, there were landscape prints way before Hokusai, but they were mainly backdrops to other things going on. Hokusai really should be credited with starting landscape prints in Japan as a genre of their own. The two waterfalls we looked at are good examples of this. And a century ago here in America, Niagara Falls would have been another great example of meisho-e. It was a common honeymoon destination. I don't would guess that it's not so much anymore, but back then it certainly was. And it's Meisho-e, which was Hokusai's main claim to fame, or is his main claim to fame today, I should say. In fact, with everything Hokusai produced over his 70-year artistic career, he's almost, not entirely, but almost exclusively known today for just a handful of landscape print series he created in the 1830s. So we've looked at two waterfalls in the landscape genre. Now, let's turn to a sampling of prints from Hokusai's most famous landscapes, in fact, his most famous anything, which is the print series entitled 36 Views of Mount Fuji. And again, let's start with a photograph. Now, a few basic facts. Mount Fuji is located about 62 miles southwest of Tokyo, and it has an elevation of some 12,400 feet above sea level, which makes it the highest mountain in Japan. And it last erupted over 300 years ago in 1707, so I wouldn't worry too much about visiting it if you're so inclined. In fact, I wouldn't worry too much about climbing it if you're so inclined. Lots of people do every summer and fall. By the way, isn't this a really beautiful photograph? It was taken either at the very end of the 19th or the very beginning of the 20th century, and obviously colored in by hand. Now, I should also mention that Mount Fuji embodies great spirituality under Shinto. A number of deities have some association with it. And there's also a belief which originates in Taoism that Mount Fuji holds the source of the secret to immortality, which is very important to Hokusai. So it's a pretty good bet that Hokusai, as a deeply spiritual person himself, believed that about the immortality of Mount Fuji himself. And that may help explain why he spent so much time in his 70s, meaning in the 1830s, depicting Mount Fuji in his prints. He did two great series of prints based on the mountain, the 36 views, of which we're about to see a representative sample, and the 100 views of Mount Fuji, which we don't have time for this evening, but I would encourage you to look that up. It's a wonderful series. So let's start the 36 views series with this. First, notice how Mount Fuji is way in the background, even as it's the unifying element for every print in this series. And we'll see how Mount Fuji's positioning in the prints varies all over the lot. Well, among other things, this print shows us a mix of social classes. So here we have a samurai accompanied by three subordinates. You have to look carefully to see all three. And here are two what were known as townsmen or city dwellers. And notice that they're bowing to the samurai. That was important because a samurai could unsheath one of the two swords he always carried on his person and cut you down with no legal consequences to himself if you failed to show respect. And the samurai himself was judge and jury as to what constituted respect. And over here, we see two laborers shouldering heavy burdens. So there's something of a cross-section of social strata in this print. Now, what we're looking at overall here is a wealthy neighborhood in Edo, as you can tell from the view of Mount Fuji. This is not exactly undesirable real estate. In fact, I can't begin to fathom what this view would sell for in today's Tokyo real estate market. By the way, this print has a lot more significance than that I just don't have time to go into, historical significance for the Tokugawa shogunate, but if anybody's interested, that could be one topic for our Q&A. Let's look at another print in this very same 36 Views series. Here, we're looking at one of Hokusai's most famous prints called South Wind, Clear Sky, but I prefer the more descriptive title you sometimes see down here, Mount Fuji in Clear Weather. And it's best known informally simply as Red Fuji for obvious reasons. That's what I'm going to call it. Now, notice that in contrast to the last print, here, Mount Fuji dominates the space. And we're looking at the eastern side of Fuji with the rays of the full morning sun hitting the upper mountain. Well, this print reflects late summer or early fall. How do I know that? Well, it takes that long for the snows on the upper mountain to melt when you're that high up. Now, what I'd like to do is to use this and some of the following Fuji prints kind of as a point of departure to show a connection between Western painting and Japanese prints. And let's start by looking at all these scattered clouds here, how they're depicted. which wouldn't be at all surprising in a Western painting, say, but that's not how clouds were typically portrayed in Japanese art. Now, look at the clouds in this print, also from the 36 views. Again, not at all out of place in a Western painting, but probably a shock to some print buyers in Japan at the time who were unaccustomed to seeing Western ideas in art. And look at how Hokusai captures lightning over the lower mountain. Very effective. All right, now I'd like to compare these two prints in the 36 views, which in both cases have Mount Fuji dominating the space. And it's interesting that Hokusai's only two prints in this series where Fuji is this dominant show them in opposite weather. Red Fuji in clear weather and Fuji here in a thunderstorm over the lower mountain. But there's a much bigger difference than that. Red Fuji is awash with areas of flat color versus shading in the vertical crevices here. Let me just go back to that so we can see it more, more clearly. All right, now, you can see the shading, right, which create the crevices. They give us a sense of depth, of three-dimensionality. So that's a Western idea that Hokusai adopted, and something he had been familiar with in Western art for a long time. Now, I said we'd talk about reciprocity in Japanese art, west to east and east to west. So let's see some examples of that right now. Red Fuji is a perfect example of why classical Japanese prints are often described as flat or two-dimensional, something which was to have an enormous influence later on the poster art of Toulouse-Lautrec, who was completely enamored of Japanese prints. In fact, it's fairly safe to say that his prints might never have existed as we know them today had he been unfamiliar with Japanese prints. And Japanese prints influenced Picasso with some of his art, although he once told Gertrude Stein in Paris that he disliked them, but we know that's not entirely true. Some of his erotic art traces directly to Hokusai. Now here on this slide, flat areas of color like we see in Red Fuji at the top also appear in some of their art. And you can see that Toulouse-Lautrec uses none of the tools in the Western artist toolkit to turn Aristide Bruant into a three-dimensional figure. He's flat as a pancake. Now look at this guitar from Picasso's Blue Period with all those flat planes of color throughout in the background and on the guitar itself. There's no depth to the sound hole, for example, to the fret wire, which separates the fret on the fingerboard, or on the bridge down here, which should rise slightly above the soundboard, above the guitar's body. The bridge is where guitars tie the end of their strings. Would Picasso have admitted to Japanese influence? Maybe not, but there are scholars who make a solid case. But now let's go back to our comparison for a moment. So not only are we looking at the mountain in two different weather scenarios, but we're seeing a single artist, Hokusai, represent Fuji from both Eastern and Western traditions, which is pretty interesting. And if something seems off kilter in these prints, it may be that Fuji is on the right when we in the West expect to see it on the left. But that's because the Japanese people read from right to left. So Hokusai placed Fuji where Japanese print buyers would expect to see it, on the right. But he didn't always do that. And in fact, his best known print does exactly the opposite, as we'll see later. And that's another possible question in the Q&A if anybody's interested. Why did he do that? Now, let's take a look at this print from the 36 views. We saw it earlier. Here, Hokusai treats clouds in the then current Japanese way. You can see up here, almost as rods coming in along the horizontal. And this was the method adopted by the Utagawa school, which was the dominant school of Japanese prints throughout the 19th century, right up into the 1890s. Well, Hokusai didn't belong to that school, belonged to the Katsushika school, but neither did he ignore it entirely. The Utagawa school may not have adopted Western style clouds, but it did go in for Western linear perspective, and so did Hokusai. So let's take a look at that. And you may have seen this before, but this is the traditional way of demonstrating linear perspective. So we look at the railroad tracks. Notice how they converge back here at a vanishing point using, in this instance, an isosceles triangle. So let's see what Hokusai does with that in his print. And there are two good examples here. First, if you look at the line of boats along the right side, notice how they get smaller the farther back they appear. And if we look at the two rows of buildings here and here, receding into the distance, they're heading toward a vanishing point also. Don't think they actually reach one, but they're heading in that direction. And directly above is Edo Castle, which was the shogun's residence back in Hokusai's day and became the emperor's residence in 1868 after the collapse of the shogunate the year before. And by the way, notice a progression here from people going about their business on the bridge to the ruler represented by the shogun's castle, and then to the divine represented by the eternal in Mount Fuji. And we can draw a straight line connecting them. We're going to see shortly that Hokusai was really taken with geometry. He used geometrical shapes and lines quite a bit in his art, and we're going to spend some time on that. But let's move on to another print in this series. In this print, we can still see horizontal clouds sort of in the Japanese style. They are coming in horizontally, right? But they're much more bulked up doing that. So this is sort of a combined east-west approach on Hokusai's part. And if you look carefully in this print, you'll see 7 cranes. If you just glance at it, you'll probably only see 5, but there are 7 here. And cranes are very important in East Asia, and they're often portrayed in Japanese art, and not only in prints, because they signify good fortune and long life, because cranes have a lifespan of some 20 to 30 years. And we can see how Hokusai uses these 2 cranes in flight to direct our eyes right up to the peak of the sacred mountain, which was so important to him. Now, let's pause for a little bit, and I'm going to keep this print up on the screen while I say something about the 36 views as a whole, because it's one of the 2 best-known print series in the entire history of Japanese prints. The other is a series by Ando Hiroshiga, who was a contemporary of Hokusai, and his series is called The 53 Stations of the Tokaido. And again, we're not going to have time, he's outside our subject matter anyway, but I would encourage you, as with the 100 views of Mount Fuji by Hokusai, I'd encourage you to look up Hiroshiga's 53 Stations, because it's an absolutely wonderful series. Now, the 36 views was the first financially successful print series in Japanese history, made a lot of money for its publishers. And it showed other publishers that print series, which kept collectors coming back for the latest print, were far more profitable in publishing unrelated individual prints, which is largely how it had been done in the 17th and 18th centuries. So after the 36 views was published in the early 1830s, the history of Japanese prints during the rest of the 19th century is mostly about series, and that carried over into the 20th century as well, and to a more limited extent has carried over into our century, the 21st. Right now, let's just take a break from our break and talk a little bit more about East-West reciprocity. In fact, by kickstarting the idea of treating a single subject in a lengthy series, Hokusai had some degree of influence on Monet's great series paintings, such as the Rouen Cathedral or the haystacks represented by these 4 paintings. Now, Monet was an avid collector of Japanese prints, as were many Impressionists. And from his contact with Japanese art dealers in Paris, he certainly would have been aware of Japanese prints in series, and also of Hokusai's idea of treating Mount Fuji in different weather, in different light, from different perspectives, which is exactly what Hokusai did with the 36 views 60 years before Monet's haystacks. Let's go back to the 36 views now in this slide. That series, the 36 views, was so successful right out the gate that the publisher decided to add 10 more Hokusai designs of Mount Fuji. So there are actually 46 designs in this series, even though the original title with 36 views remains to this day. It was never changed. So the question is why? Well, there's an interesting cultural explanation of that. It's often true in 19th century Japanese print series that the number of prints in a title is symbolic rather than literally accurate, because in Japan, numbers often have a cultural association. So in this series, for example, the number 36 suggests the 36 immortals of classical Japanese poetry, great poets from a millennium earlier, give or take a century or so. Well, would print buyers in Japan at the time have made the connection with the number 36, which was something of a marketing device on the part of Hokusai's publisher? Absolutely. Not everyone, but lots of print buyers could. Because even in Hokusai's time, as is true today, the Japanese people were among the most educated in the world. Formal schooling of one kind or another was widely available, including in rural areas. Books were in great demand, so there are lots and lots of bookshops, and there were lending libraries back then as well. Remember I said earlier that Hokusai's bread and butter business at one time was doing illustrations for books. So many people in Japan knew their country's history and literature, including ancient poetry. In fact, respect for learning in Japan goes back over 1,000 years, not from our time, from Hokusai's time, when history and literature were part of the ancient formal curriculum at Confucian schools, which were set up to educate sons of the nobility. Let's move on and look at another print in this series. Now, let's largely turn away from clouds, at least as our focus, and look at the strong internal structure that Hokusai could employ in his prints, often meaning that repeated geometrical shapes unify the design. Let me show you what I mean. You can see the triangle. You see the triangular shape of the peak of Mount Fuji here. You can see how it's taken up in the rock promontory as a left leg of a triangle and the fishing lines as a right leg of the triangle. We can imagine a base across here. Now, if we see the apex of this triangle as the fisherman's right hand, grasping those fishing lines, which I think is what Hokusai intended, then our eyes are directed symmetrically right up to the apex of the Fuji triangle, which reinforces the mountain's importance. So structure in art can sometimes be a servant of meaning. Well, this print is a great example of Hokusai's sophistication as an artist. Earlier, we talked about the importance of nature and spirituality in his art. Well, Hokusai often pits one against the other, and he certainly does that here as a study in contrasts. First, Hokusai shows nature as both a sustainer of life and a threat to life. Yeah, fish provide sustenance, but what if the fisherman falls into those rapids and there may well be rocks along the shoreline there? What then? Well, the ground supporting the outcropping of rock where he's standing is not too encouraging. If you look at this yellow-brown soil here, it looks almost eerie, doesn't it? Amorphous, like water, not something that suggests stability. Now, on another point, Hokusai divides this print horizontally. We can draw an imaginary line across here, ending at the fisherman's feet. And so in this lower area, let's just call it roughly the lower 40%. Hokusai is mostly showing us life as we know it, uncertain, sometimes in turmoil, sometimes dangerous, and we need to work to sustain ourselves, as the fisherman is doing. But in what we'll call the upper 60% up here, we see the opposite. Tranquil straight lines across here delineating fog and majestic clouds and peace suggested by the eternal in Mount Fuji, all of which couldn't contrast more with the convulsive waves below. It's quite a print. Now, I want to use my imagination here for a moment. I don't know this for a fact, but we'll call it an educated guess. I'm thinking when Hokusai finished this print, before he drew in these wavy lines, I'm thinking that maybe he looked at it and he said, something isn't quite right. My viewers have to go from the convulsive waves to the eternal up here, and that's quite a leap. So I think what's needed here is a way station, intermediate step. And that's what I think these kind of wavy lines are for. They're not straight and they're not convulsive like this. It's an intermediate step, my opinion. All right, let's look at another print from the 36 views. Now, Mount Fuji's spiritual importance largely explains Hokusai's focus on the mountain in his 70s, in the 1830s. We talked about that a little bit. But if Fuji was so important, Why is it way in the background like here in so many of the views? Well, Hokusai couldn't make Fuji dominant in every print. If he did that, his publisher might have found buyers becoming bored, losing interest as newly completed prints in the series came on the market. They didn't all come out at once. You know, if every print is measure like red Fuji, like we looked at before, why buy another one? They're all the same. But Hokusai could work in ways to satisfy himself that he was not shortchanging this sacred mountain, which meant so much to him. Yeah, Fuji is in the background, but Hokusai won't let us miss it. This bridge takes us right there, at least in two-dimensional space. In reality, we know that Mount Fuji is some 60 miles away. Look at the guy here controlling the rudder. And look at this passenger here. Notice they're both conspicuously staring at something. And naturally, we want to know what it is. So we follow their line of sight right to Fuji, like so, and like so. And here again, Hokusai strongly implies a triangle, which here sort of mirrors the outline of Mount Fuji. The hypotenuse, the longest side, sort of reflects the longer slope of the mountain right in here. So again, we can see the importance of geometry to Hokusai. Now, let's look at the rudder again. Notice that it's angled to turn the boat away from the opposite shore over here and toward Mount Fuji. But Hokusai may have been a little more subtle even than that. Look at how the eastern slope of Mount Fuji is curved. Right? Now, look at how many times Hokusai uses that same general arc in other places to tie elements of this design together. Again, using a geometrical shape or line to do that. So if we look at the building over here, we can see that same general arc taken up in the roof line as it descends from the peak. And if we drop a perpendicular line like so, from the peak of Mount Fuji down to the ferry boat, we can see another arc in the curvature of the boat and in the curvature of the wave, in fact, in all of the waves. And we see it inverted in the convex shape of the bridge. Now, there are even more curves in this print that I won't take time to mention, but all of these arcs key off Fuji's slope here and make it the central element in this print, at least to Hokusai, even though we may not see it that way, or we may not see it that way at first. But even so, we do get a clue because the peak right here sort of bifurcates this print. It's sort of in the center of the print, more or less. So the bottom line here is that the more you look at a Hokusai print, the more you're likely to discover. It makes it very worthwhile. All right, now, especially this is addressed to the gentleman with the mask. We spoke earlier. Now we come to what you may consider the main event, which is this. The print that appears on those refrigerator magnets, coffee mugs, t-shirts, and on and on. Well, Hokusai was around 70 years old when he created Under the Wave off Kanagawa, or the Great Wave, as it's better known. And he famously wrote that none of his art created before he was 70 was even worth looking at. Well, I'll let you be the judge of that yourselves in a while when we look at one of Hokusai's paintings, scroll paintings, executed 25 years earlier when he was only 45 years old. Not only is this the best known print in the 36 Views series, and probably the world's most famous print, but it's also one of the iconic expressions in any art, including literature, of the endless struggle between us, humankind, and nature. All right, let's dig in and see what this print is about. Let's start with the boats. These are express cargo boats bringing fresh seafood to Edo. And actually, there are 3 boats here, not 2. This is not one continuous boat, even though it may look like it at first glance. Well, as the most famous Japanese print of all time, the Great Wave is sometimes seen as a metaphor for ukiyo as a whole, which, if you may remember, means floating world. So that's pretty clear. We're certainly looking at a floating world in this print. And also, if you remember, and this is partly why I spent some time on it earlier, the floating world originally referenced the Buddhist concept of sorrow, suffering, and impermanence in our lives, all of which seem pretty descriptive of these people's fate, the people in the boats. You can see the people here, and there are 2 people over here as well. They don't look long for this world. Now, obviously, the wave is threatening the boats, but Hokusai takes it one step further. There's a much more dangerous quality to the wave when we look at these finger-like claws, which suggest a threatening animal, maybe a tiger, which is common in classical East Asian art. And once again, the mountain is relegated to the rear in Western perspective, though it is framed, you'll notice it's framed by the curvature of the wave. But the mountain is hardly lost in this print in any case, because along with that framing, these claws seem to point us right down to the crater, again, in two-dimensional space. So Hokusai is doing whatever he can to make sure we don't miss what was most important to him, the mountain. Now, on another point, notice the contrast between the stillness and solidity of the mountain and the dynamic fluid intensity of the great wave. The implied yin-yang symbol, you see that? Sort of an implication of a yin-yang symbol there, outlined by the contour of that wave, suggests balance between the two. So Hokusai is combining the unchanging eternal, represented by Mount Fuji, with the ever-changing impermanent world of our senses, represented by the wave, which will eventually disappear into a calm sea and restore harmony. And guess what? That's another key concept in Shinto. All right, I wish we could spend more time on this, but there's some other wonderful things to look at. Now, let's move on from waves and look at some things which reflect a long-standing Chinese influence on Japanese culture. Long before Hokusai, China was looked up to in Japan as the apex of culture and learning. Starting in ancient times, as early as some 2,000 years before Hokusai, China influenced Japan in a whole lot of ways. From introducing iron smelting, very important, introducing the Chinese systems of government and writing, and later Confucian philosophy, including the ideal of filial piety or respect and obedience to those above us in any sphere, our parents, our boss, our government, whatever. Right down to the layout of the street grid in Kyoto, based on the grid in the ancient Chinese city of Chang'an or Xi'an today. All these things came from China. So let's look at a few examples of Chinese influence in Japanese art, starting with the flower and bird genre, which originated in ancient Chinese flower and bird painting and later carried over into Japanese art, including in Hokusai's prints and in many other forms of Japanese art as well. So let's look at our first example. The title here is Bullfinch and Weeping Cherry from around 1834. And it's from an untitled series of 10 prints, which later came to be known as the Small Flowers. Hokusai also did a series of 10 large flowers. Well, the bullfinch played a role in certain Shinto shrines at New Year. And by the way, the Japanese observed what was known as a lunar New Year. It was an agricultural society, not January 1st. And Lunar New Year fell sometime between late January and sometime in February. Now, at that Lunar New Year, a wooden representation of the bird was blessed to protect against bad luck over the coming year. Now, do you see all this text inscribed in the print? It's a haiku, or haiku as we pronounce it in the West, which you may know is a Japanese poem in 17 syllables. And it's translated over here. A single bird wets its feathers and flits away, morning cherry. Morning cherry is a cherry blossom tree here that's wet with dew in the morning. So this bird is probably taking advantage of that to clean its feathers. And I'll just add that poetry was part of everyday life in Japan. And cultivated people were expected to be able to compose a poem on the spot, usually with a nature or love theme. So it's not at all unusual to see a poem like this inscribed on a Japanese print. Look at something else from the flower and bird genre, which, by the way, I forgot to mention this, so let's go back. The Japanese term for flower and bird prints is kacho-e. If you look into this, you'll see that sometimes. Now, this one is from another untitled series of 5 prints now, not 10. And each of those 5 prints depicts a creature with some kind of symbolic meaning. In this case, cranes. You can see the red-crested crane. We've already seen that cranes represent good fortune and long life. Well, this print measures around 20 inches by 9 inches, which is an unusually large format for a Japanese print in Hokusai's day, although it would not be unusual in the 20th century. And in this case, that's because the 5 prints in this series were not intended as freestanding prints. They were not intended to be collected as prints. They were intended for mounting on hanging scrolls for display in alcoves in Japanese homes. Those alcoves are known as tokonoma. And we'll look at 2 more examples of hanging scrolls later. Right now, I'd like to turn to one example of prints from a series of 10, which Hokusai created around the mid-1830s. And this series is another example of Japan's long-held regard for Chinese culture and learning. And by now, you're probably getting the idea that the 1830s were the key decade for Hokusai's art. And if you think that, you'd be right, at least in terms of how the world looks at Hokusai's art today. He did create some wonderful things outside of the 1830s, and we're going to look at a few examples, but most of how the world knows him today is from that decade. By the way, the word mirror in a print or series title refers to a look back in time. It's like you're holding up a mirror to the past. And in this case, Hokusai is looking to both Chinese and Japanese poets, mostly going back a millennium or more. So let's look at the one print I'd like to show you. This print is entitled A Peasant Crossing a Bridge, in which we see a peasant bringing home what were known as horsetail rushes that he's gathered. And these rushes were used for covering floors in ancient times to protect against the cold and damp, and for weaving what were known as tatami floor mats or straw type mats. And that theme, gathering rushes, appears in ancient Japanese poetry, as well as in the highly refined classical Japanese theater, not kabuki that we all know, but a theater that preceded kabuki by several hundred years, known as the No theater, spelled N-O-H or sometimes N-O. And once again, look at the balance here. Hokusai's treatment of water to compare turbulence to tranquility. Again, that Shinto balance. Now, the thing about this series of prints is that the poem Hokusai had in mind for each print was not spelled out for print buyers. It was not inscribed in each print. What Hokusai was doing is he was challenging his audience to figure out for themselves which poem they had in mind, something they apparently enjoyed doing. Remember, we talked about how education was widespread in Japan, even in Hokusai's day, and also that the Japanese people loved poetry. So this would not have been an insurmountable challenge to many print buyers. Let me just read you the short poem that Hokusai is thought to have had in mind. It's in an anthology from the year 1303, or about 900 years ago. When I was cutting horsetails, the autumn moon appeared, shining through the trees on Mount Sonohara. Seems to fit this print to a T. All right, now, I'd like to devote the last section of the presentation to other aspects of Hokusai's art besides prints, and we'll start with this. This is a drawing in ink and slight color on paper, and it's known as the head of an old man. The portrayal bears some relation to one of Hokusai's self-portraits, so this may actually be another self-portrait, but it's unsigned, so we'll probably never know for certain if it's a Hokusai at all. But the seals in this drawing, you can see here and here are seals, and someone tried to rub some of them out across the top. Those seals, by the way, are roughly the equivalent of a publisher's imprint today. And they're thought to have belonged to a publisher who had a close relationship with Hokusai. So for that reason and other reasons like style and the sheer brilliance of this drawing, it's usually attributed to Hokusai. I'm going to make that assumption. And I wanted to show it to you because, assuming it is in fact a Hokusai, it's a great example of his line work, his skill as a draftsman. Drawing is really about line, or at least that's one way to look at it, from the strands of hair to these whiskers to these big bold lines, which give us the cheeks and the bulging eyes. Something else about this drawing, you can easily see it as another example of Hokusai's skill with motion. We touched on that theme earlier. Now we're going to develop it. This is not a passive depiction of an old man. So the open mouth, the bulging eyes, the curvature and disarray of the hair, the almost smiling upward gaze toward the cosmos, all these things combine to make this drawing come alive. Excuse me. We're going to see another upward gaze like this in our very last slide and coming up in a bit. Let's look at something else. Now, here's the painting I referenced earlier, executed by Hokusai when he was 45 years old, and therefore not even worth looking at, according to him. Remember, he wrote that nothing he created before he was 70 was even worth a look. Well, again, we can all make our own judgments about that. This is a hanging scroll painting from around 1805. So again, not everything he did that was wonderful came from the 1830s. And here we see the woman's face only in a mirror. And there's a reason for the emphasis on the mirror. Hokusai sometimes highlights mirrors in his art because as a child, he had been adopted by an uncle who was a professional mirror polisher for the shogun. And this was before silver glass mirrors were routinely imported into Japan by the Dutch East India Company. But mirrors have a larger significance in Japan, and Hokusai would have known that. They play a role in Japan's origin, according to the ancient chronicle of Japan's creation, known as the Kojiki, compiled in 712 in the Common Era, some 1,500 years ago. A mirror is one of three sacred treasures bestowed upon Japan's line of emperors who descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. Two other treasures were a sword and a jewel. And getting back to motion, the woman may look like she's standing still, but we get a sense of motion in the S curve, framing her, the drape of her kimono, by her right foot pulled back from her left, and obviously by her left hand raised to her hair. So at the very least, there's a lot of implied motion in this painting. Now, paintings like this were on paper or silk, not canvas or wood panels in the West, although there are paintings on wood and even clay frescoes in ancient Japanese Buddhist temples. So, but not in Hokusai's day, I should say. So the Greeks and Michelangelo were not the only ones who did fresco. But this particular painting happens to be on silk, and it's affixed to a hanging scroll, although some of the scroll's parts are missing. And this work, by the way, is owned by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, but I don't believe it's on permanent display. Last couple of times my wife and I were there, we didn't see it. Okay, let's look at this. This is one of Hokusai's most dramatic works. It's an 8-panel screen painting, which showcases his imagination along with his technical skill as an artist. Let's look at a close-up of the two main panels. The name of the creature we're looking at translates to English as a phoenix, but not a Western phoenix, which rose from the ashes of its predecessor. Sarah Thompson at the MFA, remember we talked about her, the Japanese art curator, tells us about one of its purposes, and I'd like to quote her. In ancient China, it was a miraculous, auspicious creature that appeared during periods of good government that appeared to signify the approval of heaven, unquote. Well, Hokusai works in some realistic bird features like this beak here that we might see in any number of birds, and this group of black and white feathers, both contrasting with all that's fantastic here, and both therefore suggesting some connection to the real world. Right now, I want to, we'll just briefly look at this. Peacock feathers in the right-hand panels. Gold background was typical of screen painting in this period. But in this screen, Hokusai uses small cuts of gold leaf instead of the larger evenly cut pieces that you typically see in period screens or in Western art history back in the medieval and Renaissance periods. And this screen is more decorative than functional because of its small size. We look at the screen again. It's only 14 inches high and 95 inches long, by the way. So it would not have been of much use dividing space in a room or blocking drafts, blocking currents, which was the original purpose of these screens. And we're going to end our presentation tonight with a second scroll painting on silk, which is thought to be one of Hokusai's very last works, completed in 1849, the year he died. Tigers are not native to Japan, and the few which were there in the Edo era probably were gifts to high officials like the shogun. So Hokusai likely never even saw a tiger in the flesh, but there were tigers in China and Korea, as I mentioned, which were depicted in Chinese and Korean art, some of which found its way to Japan. Now, a few interesting things about this painting. Notice how the tiger's claws and paws are repeated in what are actually bamboo leaf ends, these little green things here, protruding from clumps of snow here and in this group up here that look like paws and claws, okay? And notice how the direction those leaf ends are pointing to our left reinforces the direction the tiger is heading and quickens his pace, or seems to, coaxing it along. Obviously, this brilliant artist, Hokusai, was completely focused on his art to think of something like that. He must have constantly been thinking of ways to make any particular piece more interesting, more striking, more challenging, maybe. Now, you notice all these white flecks, these snowflakes here? In a way, it's not a completely apt analogy, but it's a lot of the way there. In a way, Hokusai was anticipating Jackson Pollock's drip paintings from the 1940s. He didn't drip his paint, but he flicked white paint at the surface. And when white paint landed where he didn't want it to, like down here, he washed it out, or had an apprentice wash it out. And wow, do we ever see motion here, typical Hokusai. Here's sort of a summary slide. We've seen lots of examples of motion, the waterfalls, the waves, the old man raising his head, even that woman looking into a mirror with its suggestion of motion. This slide we didn't see, by the way, but I thought it was a great, that's from the 100 views of Mount Fuji, great example of motion. What does motion accomplish? Well, it grabs our attention for one thing, maybe suggests a story. Where's this tiger heading? What did happen to those people in the boats when the great wave finally crashed? But here, I think motion may represent something on a higher plane. We've seen that Hokusai was a devout Buddhist, so he would have believed that for most of us who do not achieve enlightenment, our lives are eternally in motion, trapped in that cycle of samsara, life, death, rebirth, maybe represented what appears like by what appears to be a smiling tiger looking upward toward the eternal, accepting of its fate, maybe, possibly welcoming its fate, as we saw in what looked like that smiling head of the old man. Or maybe this tiger has just achieved enlightenment in a previous incarnation. All four paws, notice, have left the ground. So maybe the tiger is on its way to the Pure Land in that Western paradise. Remember that? We talked about it when we saw the waterfall print named after the Amita Buddha. Could this painting, soon before his death, represent Hokusai himself, maybe in a previous incarnation as a tiger? Well, the tiger does appear to be mostly toothless, suggesting age, though we do see one tooth protruding here. But why a tiger at all, if this indeed is a metaphor for Hokusai? Well, Hokusai may not have had a lot of physical strength like a tiger. How could he? He lived in poverty at the time and could not have eaten well, but he had spiritual strength, strength of will, strength of purpose. I think from everything we've talked about and seen of his art this evening, that's as clear about him as anything else. And we'll wrap it up there with my thanks for your kind attention. And I want to thank the Morristown and Morristownship Library and Director Chad Lineweaver for inviting me back. So Chad, do we have some time now for questions?
Sure. And you know what, I may start the questions off just a little bit. Do you want to comment just very briefly on sort of like how Hokusai, I guess, at least in the Western world, I know that there was obviously a big push for an interest in Asian art, but particularly Japanese art at the turn of the last century. Is that really when a lot of interest like ballooned in him to the point where he became sort of the legendary figure he is today, or did it happen slowly over time? How did that develop?
Yes. And you raised quite a question there. We could do an entire lecture just on that point. Yes. And by the way, Boston and its suburbs were really the center of American interest in Japanese art in the time. And Bostonians were really the ones who got the ball rolling with this. There were people up here, some very wealthy collectors and art enthusiasts who went over to Japan and started collecting. They had money to throw around, and they made contacts, people who brought prints to them, and only the best prints. If you go to the MFA in Boston, for example, you will see prints that look like they were created yesterday. They're in such fine condition. The curators up there certainly know how to take care of them. But Hokusai was very much in demand in this period of Japanism, as it's known, which took root in Europe and the United States, where people wanted things Japanese. There was just a great craze for anything Japanese. And Hokusai, as one of the greatest of the Japanese print designers, was very much in demand. So it really does go back to that. Now, that was the mass interest in Hokusai. But I mentioned that the first interest in Hokusai really began in the early 1820s with the Dutch East India Company. Remember, I mentioned that the very first Hokusai art to make its way to Europe was that small group of paintings commissioned by the Dutch East India Company. And they, again, his manga, those whimsical drawings, made their way to Europe, and everybody loved them there. So the origins, I guess you could say, really go back to the 1820s, but that was very, very limited. The mass interest in Hokusai and in Japanese art as a whole really began in the second half of the 19th century and then carrying over into the early 20th century.
That's great.
Yeah.
Nobody's put any questions into the chat, but does anybody want to? Oh, actually, I just got one right now from Elizabeth. Thank you, Elizabeth. Could you expound on a couple topics on your talk? Yeah, Elizabeth, you want to unmute? You can feel free to ask or mention if there's anything in particular you want him to expand upon a little bit.
No, it was you had mentioned a couple of things in your talk, and I don't remember what they were. I didn't write them down. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. You had said, well, maybe we can talk about that later during the question period.
Right.
Of course, I didn't write them down. So,
well, I can let me jog your memory, because one thing the first thing I talked about in that regard was the print where I said that I couldn't imagine what that view would sell for in Tokyo's real estate market today. And remember, we looked at the townspeople and the laborers. Could have been that, but I just want to, there are a couple of other possibilities, because I did mention some other things.
yeah.
One thing that I just mentioned, I think, was people always ask me, how is it possible for a great artist like Hokusai to have lived in poverty in his last years? Didn't he make a lot of money with all these prints that were sold? So that's something else you may have had in mind. People also may want some book recommendations, good books on Hokusai. I can do that. People might want to know how Japanese prints were made. I have a couple of slides on that. So there are lots of things. Okay. Do any of them jog your memory? Was it that real estate, that early slide we looked at? Perhaps?
I don't recall. I don't think so. The real estate price probably wasn't it, but
well, would you like me to talk
related or art trends or something? Yeah.
Would you like me to talk about any of these things I just mentioned in particular? Like,
yeah, how were they made?
How were they made? Okay, so I really should have my wife on for this, but you want to? Okay, you know what? My wife is the artist in the family, and she often talks on my lectures. I'm going to have her come on and just cover that topic. So her name is Helen Foley Silver.
Thank you, Helen.
Hi, I'll tell you what I know. My hearing is very, very bad. So I'll start from the very, very beginning. When we're talking about the process of printmaking, we're talking about the artist as being called a designer, because he does a sketch on paper that could be kind of thought of as copy paper, very, very thin, but sturdy. He uses his brush that comes to an absolute point, and he uses sumi paint. And that ink is going to glide through the bottom of the brush, the very tip of the brush, and it has a reservoir inside of water. And the mixture of the ink on the outside and the water does the design work. That is thin lines. And those drawings are going to be taken to the print shop. Now, usually the printer commissions a painting, except sometimes in like Hokusai's case, he might have had ideas all by himself and they would be listened to. But mostly the printer would say, dictate exactly what is to be done. So now you have this sketch and it's brought to the office, so to speak. And there are a group sitting on the floor with little tables, and they are going to be carving out with the wood block. And the wood block, which is very interesting, you have to be careful where you get it. And every one of these steps is done by a craftsman. You have to have someone go out and look for the wood in a special place, season it, cut it, and season it for about 10 years, actually, and then bring it to the place where it's going to be carved. You have special paper. Here is a wood block that has already been carved. This is one we have. And you will see in this particular one, it's flowers that have been carved. The raised portion is the portion that is going to be printed on the paper, and everything is in reverse. So the paper that Hokusai brings is first going to be copied, and those copies are going to be handed to the various people who are going to be doing each color of the print. This happens to be black, but there are other colors for other wood blocks, which would be different colors, of course. So say you have 10 wood blocks. How do we get these lines so that they're all the same and they all line up? And that's where that master piece of paper that Hokusai brought is going to be copied, and then again and again and again. It is a long process, and everything is done, I would say, close to perfection. But the very bottom line with all of this is the overall view that the Japanese have of art. The tea ceremony, when you talk about, it is not a tea ceremony, it's the way of tea. It's a way of life. It's a way they arrange flowers. It's a way that they make their gardens and their houses. And it is also the way in which that painting is transferred to the wood block, and it ends up on the wall looking like a painting.
See if we have that's the paper, the Kozo
And there's the paper.
It's placed on the block.
It's mulberry paper. We call it rice paper, but it has nothing to do with rice. The paper comes from a mulberry tree, and a family usually makes the paper, and they do a very fine job of it. It's very sturdy paper, and that's why these prints, many of them have lasted. There's a whole history of this, and it is really incredible.
I just want to show,
Thank you.
If you look at this paper here, as Helen said, from the mulberry bush was typically how it was done. You can see fibers sticking out along the paper here. So if you touch a Japanese print, you're supposed to pick them up by the margins, not within the subject of the print itself. If you pick it up, a lot of Japanese prints are on extremely thin paper, like she said, but they last for centuries because of the way they're made with these fibers there, give them strength. So did you want to add something?
Yeah, I would just say this. If you get into the idea of printmaking, the one thing that makes it different than watercolors or oil paintings is that what is being produced is going to be produced by a group of artists. It wasn't just Hokusai. It was the fellow who made the paint, and the guy who carved the inkstone, and the one who made the brushes. And all of these had to be artisans that had such a high level of expertise that they brought it into an art form. So it is a collaborative process, Hanmoto, and that system that works so well that we still have some of those prints, and they are in the MFA. If you ever have an opportunity and they have a Hokusai exhibit, go.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you very much.
okay,
Appreciate the whole lecture. Thank you.
sure. Anybody else? Okay,
Tom, I think the next time you come to speak, I think you need to bring us each a Hokusai print. I think that's, if that's all right.
He says, hand out Hokusai prints. Everybody is there, right? Only fair, right?
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
understand there's a Japanese print exhibit at the Met. Do you know anything about it?
I'm sorry, did you say an exhibit at the Met?
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
A current exhibit?
yes.
Okay, I was not aware of that. We're not going to be in New Jersey for a while, but I was not aware of that, but I would certainly encourage everyone to go. They have a nice collection. Sure. Do you know what, is there a particular theme to the exhibition? Any
I don't
particular
know. My
artist?
daughter just told me about it because we were looking for an exhibit to go to.
Mhm.
Tomorrow, maybe?
Yeah. What's that?
Tomorrow?
Yeah, no, it could be
Or
anything.
very
Could be
early
anything.
ones.
Yeah, the Japanese print genre, by the way, lasted about, well, the classic period lasted about 350 years, but it's ongoing. I mean, there are people who are keeping the art form alive today. One thing I'll say that has changed, though, and I think not just Japanese prints, but in printmaking anywhere in the world, I think, is that this collaborative or Hanmoto system where you have 4 people involved, a publisher who generally comes up with the idea, hires a Hokusai to make a design, and then has a carver carve the design and a printer ink it. That no longer is the case. By the mid, let's say roughly 1950, 1970 or so, that went out of style in Japan, and artists did the whole thing themselves. So if you know any printmakers, chances are they're doing everything. They come up with their own idea, their own imagination. They come up with a design. They do the carving, the engraving, the etching, whatever it is. They do the inking, and then they do the marketing, which a publisher used to do online at an exhibition, whatever. So it's completely different today, but that process lasted for about 350 years. My point is there are lots and lots of ways to design an exhibition of Japanese prints. There's so many great artists. We just touched on one. There are many. You can design an entire exhibition around just one artist if you can get a hold of enough of their prints in good condition. Many Japanese prints today are not in good condition because people didn't know how to take care of them centuries ago. We're lucky places like the Met or the MFA have prints in such fine condition, but the vast majority of prints really could not be shown in a museum today. They were not cared for properly. Many prints were damaged or destroyed in World War II or by Japan's many earthquakes or tsunamis. So there are a relatively small number of prints in great condition today, but enough for exhibitions. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah. There was one little thing to add. When Hokusai turned over the print to the publisher, when he did that, he was compensated, not a lot. But that was the end of the connection that he really had with it. Because from there on in, the publisher, who did take a great deal of risk in publishing this series or the individual print, he was going to make the profit from it. And that's how it happened. Nowadays, when one person is doing it, they make pretty much the profit, except for maybe publicity or something like that. Also, there was another thing. Prints were not valued as they are now. In Hokusai's time, many times if you had what is called a pillar print, at the end of the season, you tore it down. Or maybe a courtesan's advertisement was up on a wall and it got torn down. So those things were not really valued at that time.
Yeah, that's right. Remember I said that a print in Hokusai's day cost the equivalent of a bowl of noodles. So they were not really highly respected. They were not even seen as art for that matter. They were sort of, you know what they were? They were the equivalent of a comic book today. That's how they were looked at. That's a very good analogy. I just want to mention, in case anybody is interested, there's one book in particular, if you sort of a starter book, an introduction to Hokusai, and that's by, I mentioned Sarah Thompson's name a few times. She has a book called Hokusai, that's the title, and it's published by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It's MFA Publications in 2015. She did that book to go along with their exhibition back then. And I recommend it anytime I do a Japanese print lecture. It's a wonderful book. The images in there are absolutely striking, and there's a lot of good information about Hokusai, his life, and the Edo period that we've been talking about. So that would be a great place to start if anybody wants to follow up.
Do you have the book, Tom, that you can hold up? Is it handy?
I unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't. I put it in the chat for everybody.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, okay.
So
no
you should be able to get it that
Yeah.
way. I think that's the
I
right
don't know.
one. Tom, you can verify it's the right one, but I think it
Yeah,
is.
I think we may have it in our Morristown bookshelves, not here. But
No, it's okay. Chad put the link in, so we're good.
yeah, well, you know what? I can tell you how you'll know you have the right book. The design on the cover is that great dragon, that what was the word?
Wrong one.
Phoenix,
Komodo.
the phoenix, right?
Oh, Phoenix.
That's on the cover of the book, part of it. They can't show the whole thing. So that's how you'll, unless they've changed the cover since 2015, but that's how you'd see it. And she did a great job. So I'd recommend that. I mean, there are lots of other books. They're much more complicated, technical, sophisticated books, which in my opinion are not a good way to get started. So there's some films. You could watch the film Seven Samurai, which is probably the most famous classic Japanese film. Akira Kurosawa, you probably heard of him, the great Japanese filmmaker, who was very influenced by American Westerns, by the way. And you see some of that in Seven Samurai. So that would be a great one to watch. There's another one called Ultimate Samurai, about Miyamoto Musashi, who was considered the greatest Japanese swordsman of all time. And it takes you through his entire life. And you just see the Edo period. And it's the first, you got to have some patience. And the first, it's 5 films. The first one may take some patience to get through, but once you get through that, the rest of it is, you'll love it.
Here,
So,
April 24.
This was such a great presentation. I can't tell you how much I learned. I really enjoyed it.
thank you very much. I appreciate that. We always have a good audience at the Morristown and Township Library.
I'd like to follow up with you later by email if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'll send a note to Chad and he'll connect us.
Okay.
So really enjoyed it. It was terrific.
Well, thank you for saying so. I really appreciate that. Okay, well, I guess we'll say goodnight, Chad.